The tears caught Takeshi Nakamura by surprise. They welled up without warning as the unfamiliar flavors exploded across his tongue. The 32-year-old Japanese naval lieutenant sat frozen on the wooden bench of Camp McCoy's mess hall, a half-eaten hamburger trembling in his hands. 3 years of war had taught him to hide weakness, yet here he was fighting back tears over American food. Around him, other Japanese prisoners experienced similar moments of shock. Some chewed silently, eyes wide with disbelief. Others whispered in hushed tones, as if afraid their reactions might be punished. One young soldier named Hiroshi openly wept, whispering between sobs, "I had forgotten the taste of fat." The American guards watched with curiosity rather than malice. One turned to another and shrugged. For them, this was merely Tuesday's lunch. For the Japanese prisoners who had survived on meager rations throughout the Pacific campaign, it was an assault on everything they believed about their enemy. They had been told Americans would torture them. That capture meant certain death or endless humiliation. Their officers had drilled into them that surrender brought only shame, and that Americans were barbaric, uncivilized beasts who would show no mercy. Yet here they sat in a heated mess hall in Wisconsin eating hamburgers and drinking Coca-Cola. This was the moment when Takeshi Nakamura's understanding of the world began to crack, though it would take months for it to shatter completely. How could these hamburgers and this strange fizzy drink contain such power? How could simple American food become the most effective weapon against years of imperial propaganda? The journey from devoted Imperial Japanese Navy officer to a man who would spend 30 years telling Americans about the transformative power of kindness began with this single hamburger in Etham 44. This is the story of how food's small gestures of humanity and unexpected decency in the midst of mankind's deadliest conflict changed one man forever. And perhaps more importantly, it's the story of the America that once was. An America that could convert enemies into admirers, not through force, but through its most fundamental values. If you served in the military during World War II or had family members who encountered prisoners of war, we would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. What moments of unexpected humanity emerged from those dark days? The Wisconsin winter of 1944 showed no mercy to anyone American or Japanese. Snow blanketed Camp McCoy under a heavy white canopy that muffled sounds and transformed the prison camp into something almost serene from a distance. Guard towers rose like sentinels against the gray sky. Barbed wire perimeters glinted with frost in the morning light. Inside the train that pulled into the camp that December morning, Takeshi Nakamura sat rigidly alongside dozens of other Japanese prisoners. His uniform, once a source of pride, hung loosely from his frame after months of inadequate rations. His hollow cheeks and sunken eyes told the story of the Pacific campaign's brutality better than any words could. The son of a prosperous Osaka merchant, Takeshi had volunteered for naval service immediately after Pearl Harbor. His father had connections with government officials and could have secured him a position away from combat, but Takeshi believed fervently in the divine mission of the emperor. He graduated near the top of his officer training and served with distinction until his ship was sunk near the Marshall Islands. For 3 days, he had drifted on a makeshift raft before American forces captured him. During those days alone on the Pacific, he had contemplated suicide repeatedly. Capture meant disgrace. Every imperial soldier knew that. Death before dishonor was not merely a slogan, it was the foundation of their military ethos. Yet when the moment came to end his life, something stopped him. Perhaps it was the thought of his young wife Yuriko and their 5-year-old daughter Hanako. Perhaps it was simple human instinct. Whatever the reason, he now faced the ultimate shame living as a prisoner of the Americans. As the train door slid open, revealing the snow-covered ground of Camp McCoy, Takeshi steeled himself for the horrors to come. Beside him sat Kenji Watanabe, a 50-year-old career soldier with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face. "Remember your training," Kenji muttered under his breath as they were ordered to disembark. "Give them nothing but your name and rank. Death may still be possible." Takeshi nodded stiffly, though doubt had begun to creep in. The Americans who had pulled him from the ocean had not executed him on the spot as he expected. They had treated his minor injuries and given him water. It contradicted everything he had been taught about American savagery. Now stepping onto American soil for the first time, he expected to be struck or spat upon. Instead, there was ordered efficiency. Guards with rifles stood at attention, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Red Cross officials with clipboards observed the proceedings, making notes and occasionally speaking with interpreters. What struck Takeshi immediately was the absence of chaos. Everything proceeded according to protocol. Prisoners lined up. Names were checked against manifests. Medical personnel assessed those who appeared ill or injured. None of this aligned with the barbaric America described in their military briefings. Where were the humiliations, the casual cruelties, the contempt for the defeated? Among the American soldiers supervising their arrival was Sergeant Robert Miller, a 24-year-old farm boy from Illinois whose older brother had died at Guadalcanal. Despite this personal loss, Miller maintained professional composure, directing prisoners with firm but not harsh commands through an interpreter. Takeshi noticed how young many of the American guards appeared. Some looked barely old enough to shave. Yet they carried themselves with the confidence of men who knew they fought for the winning side. What none of them realized as they went through the intake procedures was how the coming months would challenge everything they believed about themselves, their enemies, and the true meaning of humanity in wartime. The rigid ideologies each man carried would soon face the most powerful force of all daily human connection. The processing began immediately. The Japanese prisoners were directed to a large wooden building where they were instructed to remove their tattered uniforms. Many hesitated, seeing this as the first step toward humiliation. Takeshi watched as Kenji's face hardened into a mask of defiance. "This is where it begins," Kenji whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. But instead of mockery or abuse, they were directed to shower facilities with hot water, something many hadn't experienced in months. They were issued new clothing, plain but warm uniforms marked with PW in large letters. Medical personnel examined them efficiently, but not roughly, noting signs of malnutrition and treating various ailments. One young prisoner named Hiroshi Tanaka, barely 22, had a festering wound on his arm that had gone untreated for weeks. He winced as an American doctor named Anderson cleaned and dressed it properly. "Why would you treat us?" Hiroshi asked, through an interpreter, confusion evident in his voice. The doctor continued working as he answered, "War doesn't erase my Hippocratic oath. You're a patient now, not just an enemy." Takeshi overheard this exchange and felt another small crack in his understanding of Americans. In Japan, they had been told American doctors performed experiments on prisoners. Yet here was evidence to the contrary. After processing, they were marched across the compound to their barracks. Snow crunched beneath their new boots. The cold bit through their clothes, but for the first time in months, Takeshi wasn't perpetually wet from Pacific humidity or ocean spray. The Wisconsin cold was fierce, but somehow cleaner, more honest in its harshness. The barracks themselves were simple wooden structures with bunks lined in rows, each provided with wool blankets and small personal storage areas. Stoves at either end provided warmth that felt almost miraculous after months of exposure to the elements. The men settled into their assigned spaces with varying degrees of suspicion. Some, like Kenji, sat rigidly on their bunks, refusing to show any appreciation for these basic accommodations. Others, particularly the younger soldiers, cautiously tested the mattresses with their hands as though afraid the comfort might be some elaborate trick. Takeshi claimed a bunk near the window, wanting to observe as much of the camp as possible. Strategic information might still be valuable somehow, though he had no realistic way to communicate with Japanese forces. Perhaps it was merely habit, or perhaps it was his way of maintaining some sense of purpose as an officer. That first night in Camp McCoy was disorienting. The relative quiet, broken only by occasional coughs, and the creak of men turning on unfamiliar mattresses seemed almost supernatural. After years of military noise engines, explosions, shouted orders, groans of the wounded. "This is merely the beginning," Kenji told a small group gathered around his bunk. "They fatten us like cattle before slaughter. American kindness is more dangerous than their cruelty. It weakens resolve. Remember your oath to the Emperor." Some nodded solemnly. Others looked uncertain. Takeshi said nothing, but questions multiplied in his mind. If Americans truly were the barbarians described in their training, why this adherence to international law? Why the presence of Red Cross observers? Why provide adequate food and shelter to captured enemies? The mystery deepened the following morning when they were escorted to the mess hall for breakfast. Again, Takeshi braced himself for disappointment, expecting perhaps watery gruel or stale bread. The line moved slowly through the serving area, and the smell that greeted them was unlike anything they had experienced in months, rich, warm, substantial. American cooks, wearing white aprons, served generous portions of eggs, bacon potatoes, and toast. Coffee steamed in large mugs. The portions were not extravagant by American standards, but to men who had survived on increasingly meager rations, as Japan's supply lines faltered, it seemed like a feast. Takeshi watched as the prisoner ahead of him, an older man named Sato, actually trembled when handed his tray. The man stood frozen for several seconds until a guard gently prompted him to move forward. When Takeshi received his own tray, the weight of it surprised him. Real food, hot and plentiful. He followed others to long tables where they sat together, many staring at their trays in disbelief. Kenji made a show of eating slowly, suspiciously examining each bite as though looking for poison. Others fell upon their food with barely restrained desperation, though most maintained enough discipline to eat with proper manners. The guard nearest their table, a freckled young man who looked barely 20, watched them with curiosity rather than hostility. When he caught Takeshi looking at him, he nodded slightly, a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity that felt profoundly disorienting. After breakfast, they learned the routine of camp life. Roll call in the morning, assigned work details, recreation periods, male privileges under supervision. Everything operated according to regulations with consequences for infractions, but no arbitrary punishment. As days passed, the rhythms of Camp McCoy gradually became familiar. Work assignments rotated among the prisoners. Some cleared snow from roads and pathways. Others helped in the kitchens or laundry. Some, including Takeshi, were eventually assigned to assist at nearby farms under guard supervision. It was during these farm assignments that Takeshi first encountered ordinary Americans outside the military structure. One such American was Frank Thompson, a weather-beaten farmer in his 60s who had lost his son at Pearl Harbor. Thompson made no effort to hide his hostility toward the Japanese prisoners who worked his land under guard supervision. The first day Takeshi worked at the Thompson farm, the old farmer spat on the ground near his feet and muttered something Takeshi couldn't understand, but recognized as contempt. Sergeant Miller, who supervised this particular work detail, tensed visibly but maintained his professional demeanor. "Mr. Thompson," Miller said quietly, "these men are under Geneva Convention protection." "My boy ain't under no protection," Thompson replied bitterly. "He's under the Pacific Ocean thanks to them." The raw grief in the man's voice penetrated Takeshi's carefully maintained reserve. For the first time, he truly contemplated the individual American losses that mirrored Japanese ones. Not abstract casualties in reports, but sons and brothers and fathers who would never return home. The symmetry of suffering across enemy lines was something his military training had never addressed. Despite this initial hostility, working at the Thompson farm became significant in ways Takeshi could never have predicted. It provided a window into American civilian life that contradicted imperial propaganda at every turn. Back at the camp, relationships among the prisoners grew increasingly complex. Clear divisions emerged between those who maintained rigid adherence to imperial doctrine and those who began to question previously unassailable beliefs. Kenji Watanabe established himself as the unofficial leader of the traditionalists, using his age and rank to maintain influence. He watched with growing disapproval as some prisoners, particularly younger ones, began to adapt to camp life with what he considered inappropriate acceptance. Hiroshi Tanaka, the young soldier with the treated arm wound, represented the opposite perspective. Openly curious about American life, he eagerly absorbed whatever information became available. He was the first to volunteer when English language classes were offered in the evenings. Takeshi occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. As an officer, he felt responsible for maintaining proper discipline and morale among his men. Yet his observations increasingly contradicted the worldview he had accepted without question throughout his military career. The tension came to a head one evening after another surprisingly substantial dinner. In their barracks, Kenji confronted a group of younger prisoners who had been practicing English phrases. "You dishonor Japan with every American word you speak," he said, his voice low but intense. "Have you forgotten your oath to the emperor so quickly?" Hiroshi, emboldened perhaps by his recovery or by genuine conviction, responded with unexpected firmness. "Learning their language doesn't make me less Japanese. Understanding the enemy is strength, not weakness." Understanding. Kenji nearly spat the word. "What is there to understand about barbarians who bomb our cities and kill our families? The irony of this statement, given Japan's own actions in China and throughout Asia, wasn't lost on Takeshi, though he remained silent. The selective vision of wartime patriotism affected both sides equally, he was beginning to realize. The argument escalated until Kenji struck Hiroshi across the face, splitting his lip. Takeshi intervened, then stepping between them. "Enough," he said firmly. "We remain soldiers of Japan, regardless of our circumstances. Discipline and honor require self-control, Kenji-san." The older man glared at Takeshi, betrayal evident in his eyes. "You too, Lieutenant. I thought you understood what it means to serve the Emperor." "I understand that dividing ourselves serves no one," Takeshi replied evenly. "Not Japan, not the Emperor, not ourselves." The confrontation ended without further violence, but the ideological fracture among the prisoners widened. Some clustered around Kenji, embracing his unyielding stance. Others gravitated toward Hiroshi's more adaptive approach. Takeshi found himself increasingly isolated, trusted fully by neither camp. This isolation provided space for observation and reflection. Takeshi began paying closer attention to the Americans who guarded them, particularly Sergeant Miller, who supervised many of their work details with quiet efficiency. Miller was not friendly exactly, but neither was he unnecessarily harsh. He maintained appropriate professional distance while treating prisoners with basic human dignity. He followed regulations precisely, neither adding personal cruelty nor offering inappropriate leniency. One cold afternoon, while supervising the farm detail, Miller pulled a wallet from his pocket during a brief rest period. Takeshi noticed him looking at a photograph with an expression of mingled pride and sadness. Without thinking, Takeshi asked through their interpreter, "Family?" Miller seemed startled by the personal question from a prisoner, but after a moment's hesitation nodded. "My mother, father, and sisters," he said briefly, turning the photo so Takeshi could see 4 smiling faces in front of a modest farmhouse. "In Illinois," Miller added, pointing to himself. "Farm like this one." The simple exchange, lasting less than a minute, affected Takeshi deeply. This American enemy had a family he loved. He came from a farm not unlike those in rural Japan. He kept their photograph close to his heart, even in war. These were not the characteristics of a barbarian or a monster. They were entirely recognizably human. Later that week, Takeshi received his first letter from home. Mail delivery to prisoners was slow and heavily censored, but the sight of Yuriko's careful handwriting on the envelope made his hands tremble. He took the letter to his bunk and read it privately, though privacy was a relative concept in the crowded barracks. The news from Japan was grim. Food shortages had worsened. Air raid sirens sounded regularly in Osaka. Yuriko and Hanako had moved to her parents' home in the countryside for safety, but conditions there were hardly better. They subsisted largely on vegetables from small garden plots and whatever rice could be obtained through rationing. The contrast between their desperate circumstances and his relatively comfortable captivity struck Takeshi with the force of a physical blow. While his family scraped by on inadequate food in a nation increasingly under siege, he ate 3 substantial meals daily. While they huddled in fear of American bombs, he experienced American treatment that, while not friendly, was fundamentally fair. The cognitive dissonance was becoming impossible to ignore. Either the Americans were not the uniformly cruel barbarians described in imperial propaganda, or they reserved their cruelty exclusively for the battlefield while maintaining civilized treatment of captured enemies. Neither explanation aligned neatly with the worldview Takeshi had accepted throughout his military career. That night, he lay awake long after lights out, listening to the steady breathing and occasional snores of his fellow prisoners. Outside, snow fell silently, adding another layer to the already blanketed landscape. An American guard walked his patrol route, boots crunching rhythmically. Everything Takeshi had been taught about Americans was being systematically contradicted by his daily experiences. The intellectual understanding that propaganda might not align with reality was one thing. The lived experience of that contradiction was another entirely. His mind returned to the hamburger and Coca-Cola from that first meal. Such simple things, hardly worthy of note to Americans, had provoked tears and disbelief among hardened Japanese soldiers. The Americans hadn't presented these items as special treats or rewards. This was simply how they fed everyone, including prisoners. What kind of nation could afford such generosity even to enemies? What did it say about America that even in wartime, with rationing and shortages affecting their own population, They maintained these standards for captured foes. More importantly, what did it mean for Japan that the portrayal of Americans as subhuman monsters had been so thoroughly disproven by something as simple as a hamburger? None of the other Japanese prisoners knew the full extent of Takeshi's internal struggle. They saw only a respected officer maintaining appropriate dignity in difficult circumstances. Even Kenji, who watched him with increasing suspicion, couldn't access the profound questions forming in Takeshi's mind. For now, Takeshi kept these thoughts private, but the seeds planted by that first meal in Camp McCoy had taken root. They would continue growing nourished by each small act of unexpected humanity until they flowered into something neither Takeshi nor his American captors could have predicted. The truth that would eventually transform his life was beginning to emerge. Sometimes the most powerful weapons against hatred aren't found on battlefields, but in mess halls where enemies discover their shared humanity over something as simple as food. No one in that Wisconsin prison camp could have known that the hamburgers and Coca-Cola served that winter would eventually become symbols of reconciliation, or that one confused Japanese officer would spend decades telling this story to anyone who would listen. But that was all still to come. For now, there was only the snow, the camp, and the slowly shifting perspective of a man caught between worlds, between loyalties, between versions of truth. The stage was set for a transformation that would touch not just Takeshi Nakamura, but everyone who encountered his story in the decades to come. And it had begun with the simple revolutionary act of treating an enemy with basic human dignity. The morning after receiving the letter from Yuriko, Takeshi joined the work detail assigned to the Thompson farm with a heavier heart than before. Knowledge of his family's suffering while he ate regular meals created a guilt that gnawed at him relentlessly. The American guards, oblivious to his internal struggle, maintained their usual professional distance as they transported the prisoners to the farm in the back of a covered truck. Wisconsin winter showed no signs of relenting. The landscape remained buried under thick snow, and their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Takeshi found himself between two worlds, the physical reality of American captivity and the emotional reality of connection to a Japan increasingly under siege. As they arrived at the Thompson farm, Sergeant Miller issued instructions through the interpreter. Today they would clear snow from the barn entrance and help repair a damaged fence. Simple tasks, but necessary ones for the functioning of the farm. Frank Thompson greeted them with his usual cold stare. The aging farmer made no effort to hide his antipathy, keeping his distance as he pointed out the areas that needed attention. His weathered face, lined with decades of outdoor work, seemed permanently set in a scowl when Japanese prisoners were present. "Your men work that section," he said to Miller, deliberately avoiding eye contact with any of the Japanese. "Keep them away from the house." Miller nodded, maintaining the delicate balance between respecting the farmer's wishes and ensuring proper treatment of the prisoners. "Yes, sir. We'll have this cleared by noon." Takeshi understood more English than he let on. The evening language classes which he attended, secretly despite Kenji's disapproval, had begun to yield results. He caught the basic meaning of these exchanges, though many specific words still eluded him. The work was physically demanding, but not excessive. Takeshi found himself welcoming the exertion as a distraction from his troubled thoughts. The simple act of shoveling snow allowed his mind temporary respite from the contradictions that increasingly defined his existence. Midway through the morning, Takeshi paused to catch his breath, leaning on his shovel and gazing across the snow-covered fields. In the distance, the Thompson farmhouse stood as a symbol of American rural life, sturdy, practical, permanent. Smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting warmth within that contrasted sharply with the biting cold outside. He was so lost in thought that he failed to notice Frank Thompson approaching until the man stood just a few feet away, observing him with narrowed eyes. "You an officer?" Thompson asked abruptly. Takeshi straightened, recognizing the question. He nodded once, maintaining the dignified bearing expected of an Imperial Japanese Navy lieutenant. Thompson spat into the snow. "My boy was on the Arizona, lieutenant like you, 23 years old." The interpreter standing nearby translated this, though Takeshi had understood the essential meaning. The Arizona had been one of the American battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor. Thompson's son had died in the attack that launched the Pacific War. Takeshi met the old farmer's gaze, directly seeing not just anger, but bone-deep grief. For a moment, neither man spoke. What could possibly be said across such a divide? Finally, Takeshi responded in careful, broken English. "I'm sorry for your son. The words were simple, insufficient, perhaps even inappropriate coming from an enemy officer. Yet they were also deeply human, an acknowledgement of loss that transcended national boundaries. Thompson's face hardened. He took a step forward, raising his hand as though to strike Takeshi. Sergeant Miller moved quickly to intervene, but before he reached them, Thompson froze his hand still raised. Something passed across the farmer's weathered features, a complex emotion that Takeshi couldn't fully interpret. Then Thompson lowered his arm, turned without another word, and walked back toward the farmhouse, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. "Back to work," Miller ordered quietly, diffusing the tension of the moment. Later, as they prepared to return to camp, Takeshi noticed Miller watching him with an appraising expression. The American sergeant seemed to be reassessing something, though what precisely remained unclear. "Lieutenant," Miller said, finally addressing Takeshi directly with unexpected formality, "what you said to Mr. Thompson, that was—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Honorable." The simple acknowledgement coming from an American carried weight that Takeshi hadn't anticipated. It wasn't praise exactly, but recognition of shared values that supposedly couldn't exist between enemies. When they returned to Camp McCoy, Takeshi discovered that tensions among the Japanese prisoners had escalated during his absence. Kenji had confronted several men who attended English classes, publicly berating them for embracing the enemy's language. The confrontation had nearly become physical before guards intervened. That evening in the barracks, Kenji approached Takeshi with evident suspicion. "You disappear in the evenings, Lieutenant," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable accusatory edge. "Where do you go?" Takeshi met the older man's gaze steadily. "I observe the Americans, Kenji-san. I learn their patterns, their behaviors. Knowledge of the enemy remains valuable, regardless of our circumstances." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it obscured his growing curiosity about American language and culture. Kenji seemed partially satisfied with this explanation, though doubt lingered in his expression. "Be careful not to learn too much," Kenji warned. "Some knowledge changes a man in ways he doesn't intend." The irony of this statement wasn't lost on Takeshi. Indeed, his observations were changing him, though not in the way Kenji feared. He was learning not to hate more effectively, but to question the very foundations of that hatred. The English classes became Takeshi's refuge from the increasing tensions among the Japanese prisoners. Held in a small room off the main recreation area, they were taught by an American sergeant named Wallace, a former high school teacher from Oregon, whose patience and methodical approach made him an effective instructor despite the language barrier. Hiroshi Tanaka attended these classes openly, disregarding Kenji's disapproval. The young soldier's arm had healed well under Dr. Anderson's care, and his natural curiosity made him an eager student. Several other younger prisoners also participated, along with a few older men who had decided that practical adaptation outweighed ideological purity. Takeshi, mindful of his position as an officer, attended inconsistently and often arrived after class had begun, slipping in quietly. Sergeant Wallace noticed this pattern, but made no comment, simply incorporating the lieutenant into whatever lesson was underway. One evening, as Wallace was teaching basic conversational phrases, he asked each prisoner to practice introducing themselves and stating something they enjoyed. When Takeshi's turn came, he said carefully, "I am Lieutenant Nakamura. I enjoy watching stars." He pointed upward to clarify his meaning. Wallace nodded encouragingly. "Very good. Do you know any star names in English?" Takeshi hesitated, then responded, "Big Bear." He made a scooping gesture with his hand, approximating the constellation's shape. "The Big Dipper," Wallace corrected gently. "Part of Ursa Major, which does mean Great Bear in Latin. Excellent connection." This small moment of successful communication across language barriers gave Takeshi unexpected satisfaction. There was power in being understood, in connecting through words rather than weapons. After class, Hiroshi approached Takeshi as they walked back to the barracks. "Lieutenant, may I ask you something?" the younger man said hesitantly. Takeshi nodded his permission. "Why do you hide your attendance from the others? As an officer, your example could encourage more men to learn English." The question was perceptive and deserved an honest answer, though Takeshi wasn't certain he fully understood his own motivations. "My position complicates things," he replied after a moment. "Some would see my participation as permission. Others would see it as betrayal. Neither serves the men well right now." Hiroshi considered this. "But what do you believe, Lieutenant? Not what serves the men, but what you truly think." The directness of the question startled Takeshi. In the rigid hierarchy of military life, subordinates rarely questioned officers' personal beliefs so explicitly. Before he could formulate a response, they rounded the corner of a building and encountered Kenji with two of his closest followers. The older man's expression darkened immediately when he saw them together. "So, this is how Japan's officers spend their evenings," Kenji said coldly. "Learning to bark in American tongues like trained bugs." Takeshi straightened his face, carefully neutral. "Careful, Watanabe-san. Your words approach insubordination." Kenji gave a bitter laugh. "Insubordination. Here we are all equally prisoners, now, Lieutenant. Your rank exists only in memory." The confrontation drew the attention of other prisoners returning to the barracks, as well as a nearby guard who watched closely but didn't immediately intervene. "Rank or no rank, respect remains essential," Takeshi replied evenly. "We are still Japanese soldiers." "Are we?" Kenji stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I wonder, Lieutenant, when you eat American food, speak American words, work American land, what remains of your Japanese spirit?" The question struck uncomfortably close to Takeshi's own internal struggles. Before he could respond, Kenji continued, his voice rising. "I've watched you with the American sergeant, exchanging words, even smiles. I've seen how you look at this place, not with the hatred of a loyal Japanese officer, but with curiosity, with interest." Other prisoners had gathered now, forming an impromptu audience for this confrontation that represented the ideological division running through the camp. "You mistake observation for acceptance," Takeshi said carefully. "A wise soldier studies his enemy, and a traitor begins by calling his enemy his teacher," Kenji retorted. The word traitor ignited something in Takeshi. Before he could control his reaction, he stepped forward and seized Kenji by the front of his uniform. "Never question my loyalty," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The guard moved closer now, hand on his baton, ready to intervene. Takeshi became aware of the audience of the potential consequences of his responsibility as an officer to maintain discipline, rather than fracture it further. With effort, he released his grip on Kenji and stepped back, composing himself. "This discussion is concluded," he said firmly, using his command voice. "Return to your bunks, all of you." Surprisingly, his authority still carried weight. The gathered prisoners dispersed, though many whispered among themselves. Kenji maintained eye contact for a long moment, his expression a mixture of triumph and genuine concern, before turning away. The guard watched until everyone had moved inside, then resumed his patrol. The confrontation had ended without physical violence, but Takeshi knew the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Inside the barracks, he made his way to his bunk, acutely aware of the eyes following him. The incident had forced the divisions among the prisoners into the open. Men would now have to choose sides more explicitly than before. Hiroshi approached hesitantly, sitting on the edge of the bunk opposite Takeshi's. "I apologize, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "I didn't intend to cause trouble by speaking with you." Takeshi shook his head. "The trouble exists whether we speak of it or not, Tanaka-san. Some men find comfort in certainty, even when evidence contradicts their beliefs. Kenji clings to his understanding of the world because the alternative is too difficult to contemplate." "And you, Lieutenant, what do you believe now?" Takeshi considered the question carefully. "I believe that nothing is as simple as we were taught. Not Americans, not this war, not even our own purpose within it." The admission felt dangerous, yet also liberating. Speaking the doubt aloud somehow made it more manageable, less overwhelming. Hiroshi nodded slowly. "The first time the American doctor changed my bandage, he showed me the infection in my wound and explained how the medicine would help. He could have simply treated me like an animal without explanation. That small respect, it made me question everything." The observation resonated with Takeshi's own experience. It was the accumulation of small moments of unexpected humanity, rather than any single dramatic event, that gradually eroded the foundation of enemy caricatures. Their conversation ended as lights out was announced, but Takeshi lay awake long afterward, contemplating the growing rift among the prisoners and his own evolving perspective. He had been trained to resist torture, to withstand hardship, to die with honor rather than surrender. Nothing had prepared him for the challenge of simple human decency from those he had been taught to hate. The following morning brought news that disrupted the camp routine. Several prisoners, including Takeshi and Kenji, would be assigned to a new work detail, helping local farmers prepare early vegetable plantings in heated greenhouses. The announcement meant they would spend more time away from the main camp, working in smaller groups under less direct supervision. As they waited to board the transport truck, Sergeant Miller approached Takeshi. "Lieutenant, I've been instructed to inform you that you'll be working at the Thompson farm today," he said through the interpreter. "Mr. Thompson specifically requested your assignment to his property." The news surprised Takeshi. After their tense encounter the previous day, he had expected the farmer to ban him from the property entirely. Miller seemed equally puzzled by the request, but offered no additional explanation. Upon arrival at the Thompson farm, they found the farmer waiting for them near his greenhouse, a long structure with glass panels covered in a thin layer of frost. His expression remained stern, but lacked the open hostility of previous encounters. "You," he said, pointing directly at Takeshi. "Come with me. The others work with your sergeant outside." Miller hesitated, regulations requiring that prisoners remain under guard supervision at all times. "Mr. Thompson, I'll need to accompany the lieutenant." Thompson shrugged. "Suit yourself, but he's the only one I want in my greenhouse. He seems to know how to speak without saying too much." The cryptic statement confused both Takeshi and Miller, but they followed the farmer into the greenhouse. Inside, the air was noticeably warmer, humid, with the smell of damp earth and growing things. Rows of small plants stretched the length of the building, green shoots reaching toward the filtered sunlight. Thompson moved to a workbench covered with small clay pots, seeds, and soil. He gestured for Takeshi to approach. "My wife says I owe you words," he said gruffly, "for what you said about my boy yesterday." Takeshi remained silent, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. Thompson continued, his weathered hands arranging pots with practiced efficiency. "Don't mistake me, I got no love for Japan or what you people did, but Martha says hate's a poison that kills the one carrying it first." He pushed several pots toward Takeshi. "These need soil, then one seed each. Think you can manage that without a translator?" Takeshi nodded, understanding the basic task. He began filling pots with the rich, dark soil, working carefully alongside the American farmer. Sergeant Miller stood near the entrance, watching with evident curiosity, but maintaining a respectful distance. For nearly an hour, they worked in silence, broken only by occasional practical instructions. The simple, life-affirming act of planting seeds created a strange atmosphere between them, neither friendly nor hostile, but focused on creation rather than destruction. Eventually, Thompson spoke again, his voice lower, more contemplative. "You have family back in Japan." Through his growing English comprehension and Thompson's deliberate simplicity, Takeshi understood. He nodded. "Wife, daughter, 5 years old." Thompson absorbed this information with a slight nod. "War's hardest on the little ones. They don't understand why their daddies leave, why food gets scarce, why the world turns mean all of a sudden." There was no triumph in his tone, no satisfaction at the thought of Japanese children suffering, just a weary acknowledgement of war's universal impact on the innocent. "My son Jimmy," Thompson continued, "he used to help me plant every spring since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Had a way with growing things. Always said he'd take over the farm someday." Takeshi listened silently, recognizing the importance of this moment. This wasn't casual conversation, but something approaching a ritual, a sharing of grief between nominal enemies. "Last thing he wrote me," Thompson said, voice growing rougher, "was that he'd be home for spring planting. Said he'd seen enough killing to last a lifetime. Wanted to get back to growing things." He looked up, then meeting Takeshi's eyes directly. "Never made it home. And here I am planting with one of the men whose country put him at the bottom of the ocean." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then Thompson handed Takeshi a small paper packet. "These are tomato seeds. Special variety my family's grown for 3 generations. Jimmy would have planted these rows this year." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on Takeshi. He accepted the packet with appropriate solemnity, understanding that he was being invited, however reluctantly, to stand in for the farmer's dead son in this specific ritual. They completed the planting in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, containing, if not reconciliation, then at least mutual recognition of shared humanity. When they returned to the main camp that afternoon, Takeshi carried with him more than memories of an unusual work detail. He had glimpsed something profound about the American character through Frank Thompson, something that contradicted every caricature presented in imperial propaganda. Here was a man who had every reason to hate, whose personal loss justified bitterness, yet who found himself drawn, however reluctantly, toward connection rather than continued enmity. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but something more complex and perhaps more honest, the recognition that humanity persists even through the artificial divisions of war. That evening, as the prisoners gathered in the mess hall for dinner, Takeshi noticed Kenji watching him with increased suspicion. The older man had observed his separate assignment at the Thompson farm and clearly resented the apparent special treatment. The confrontation Takeshi had been expecting came later in the barracks when Kenji approached with several supporters. "Enjoying your private American garden party, Lieutenant?" Kenji asked, making no effort to hide his contempt. "Perhaps next they'll invite you to dine at their tables." Rather than responding defensively, Takeshi made a decision. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small packet of tomato seeds Thompson had given him, holding it out for Kenji to see. "The farmer who gave me these lost his son at Pearl Harbor," Takeshi said quietly. "His only son who would have planted these this spring. Instead, he asked me to help." Kenji stared at the seed packet, momentarily confused by this unexpected response. "Why are you telling me this?" he demanded. "Because nothing about this war is as simple as we were taught," Takeshi replied. "Not Americans, not ourselves, not victory or defeat." Kenji's face hardened. "You speak treason, Lieutenant. These seeds have planted American thoughts in your mind." "I speak reality, Watanabe-san. The reality that men on both sides plant seeds, love their children, and grieve their losses. This doesn't make me less Japanese. It makes me more human." The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment a guard appeared with an unexpected announcement. A new shipment of mail had arrived from Japan, including several letters for prisoners at Camp McCoy. The prospect of communication from home immediately drew everyone's attention away from the ideological confrontation. Men gathered eagerly as names were called and precious envelopes distributed. Takeshi received his second letter from Yuriko, this one dated nearly 2 months earlier. With trembling hands he opened it, his earlier conversation with the Kenji temporarily forgotten as he reconnected with his distant family. The letter contained a small photograph of Yuriko and Hanako standing in front of her parents' rural home. Their faces appeared thinner than he remembered, but they were smiling bravely for the camera. Hanako held a small doll he didn't recognize, perhaps a gift from her grandparents. The sight of his daughter, noticeably taller than in his memory, struck Takeshi with the brutal reality of time's passage. She was growing up without him, experiencing a childhood defined by war's privations and his absence. Would she even recognize him if he returned? Would she know her father as anything more than a uniform and a photograph? Yuriko's carefully composed words described their daily life without complaint. Though reading between the lines, Takeshi could sense the hardships they endured. Food shortages had worsened. Air raids now occurred regularly. Many of their neighbors had lost homes, or worse. One passage particularly affected him. "Hanako asked yesterday when the war will end, so you can come home. I told her that you are serving the emperor bravely and that someday you will return to us. She said she prays for this every night. I did not tell her that I do the same." The letter from home clutched in his hands. Takeshi sat motionless on his bunk while activity swirled around him. Other prisoners received their mail with varying degrees of emotion. Some wept openly, while others maintained stoic facades despite the trembling of their hands. The physical connection to a distant homeland transformed the barracks, temporarily creating an atmosphere of shared vulnerability that transcended the ideological divisions among them. Even Kenji, who had received a brief note from his brother, retreated to his bunk to read in private, the confrontation with Takeshi momentarily forgotten. Takeshi studied the photograph again, tracing the outline of his daughter's face with a gentle finger. She looked so much like her mother, the same determined set of her small jaw, the same thoughtful eyes. The doll she clutched was unfamiliar to him, a small handmade thing, probably crafted from whatever scraps Yuriko had managed to find. Even in hardship, his wife had found a way to provide their daughter with some small comfort. A shadow fell across his bunk. Looking up, Takeshi found Sergeant Miller standing nearby, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your family?" the American asked, gesturing toward the photograph. Takeshi nodded, turning the small image so Miller could see. The sergeant studied it for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew his own wallet. From it, he removed a similar photograph, this one showing a young woman holding a baby. "My wife Helen, my son James, born after I shipped out. Never met him in person yet." The simple statement bridged the vast divide between them more effectively than any official policy or diplomatic language could have. Both men, regardless of uniform or national allegiance, shared the fundamental experience of separation from those they loved most. Miller tucked his photo away carefully. Mail call at the Thompson farm tomorrow, 6 a.m. departure. Takeshi understood that the sergeant was offering him advance notice of another opportunity to work at the farm away from Kenji's increasingly hostile scrutiny. He nodded his appreciation for both the information and the small moment of connection. That night, as the barracks settled into uneasy sleep, Takeshi found himself contemplating the steady accumulation of moments that were reshaping his understanding of the world. The hamburger and Coca-Cola that first shocked him with their abundance. Dr. Anderson treating Japanese wounds with the same care he would give Americans. Thompson sharing his family's heirloom tomato seeds. And now Miller showing him a son he had never met, a mirror of Takeshi's own paternal longing. None of these actions erased the reality of war. Pearl Harbor had happened. Japanese cities were being bombed. Men on both sides continued to die on Pacific islands with unpronounceable names. But these small human connections made it impossible to maintain the simplistic view of faceless, inhuman enemies that military training had instilled. Morning arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the camp in fresh white. As Takeshi prepared for the farm detail, he noticed Kenji watching him with narrowed eyes. The older man made no move to speak, but his disapproval radiated clearly across the barracks. The truck ride to the Thompson farm proceeded in relative silence, the prisoners huddled against the cold. Takeshi found himself looking forward to the greenhouse with its humid warmth and the simple, life-affirming task of tending growing things. Upon arrival, however, the scene that greeted them was unexpected. A group of local children stood near the farmhouse bundled in winter coats and scarves, watching the Japanese prisoners with undisguised curiosity. A young woman, presumably their teacher, stood nearby in conversation with Mrs. Thompson. Sergeant Miller looked equally surprised but quickly recovered his professional demeanor. "School field trip to see the greenhouse," he explained briefly to the prisoners through the interpreter. "Stay focused on your work assignments. No interaction with the children." The Japanese prisoners were directed toward their various tasks, with Takeshi once again assigned to the greenhouse. As he walked the path toward the glass structure, he became aware of the children following at a distance, whispering among themselves. Inside the greenhouse, Frank Thompson was already at work, checking seedlings that had been planted days earlier. He acknowledged Takeshi with a curt nod. "Schools teach agriculture now," he explained without preamble. "Kids coming to see how food grows in winter." Takeshi nodded his understanding, moving to the workbench where new planting tasks awaited. Through the glass walls, he could see the children approaching, led by their teacher and Mrs. Thompson. The door opened, allowing a blast of cold air, followed by excited young voices. The children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, entered with wide eyes, taking in the rows of green growth and the unusual sight of a Japanese prisoner working alongside the American farmer. Their teacher, a young woman with a practical demeanor, began explaining the purpose of the greenhouse, but many of the children's eyes remained fixed on Takeshi. He focused on his work, aware of their scrutiny, but careful to make no movements that might be perceived as threatening. After the formal tour, Mrs. Thompson invited the children to ask questions. Most focused on the plants. How long until tomatoes grew, why the greenhouse was warm when outside was freezing, what made the soil so dark. Then a small girl with braided red hair raised her hand. "Why is that man wearing different clothes? And what do those letters mean?" The adults exchanged glances. The teacher began a careful explanation about prisoners of war using simple terms appropriate for children. Takeshi continued working, pretending not to understand, though he followed most of her explanation. "So he's from Japan?" another child asked. "Like the people who bombed Pearl Harbor?" "Yes," the teacher confirmed, "but he's a prisoner now, so there's nothing to be afraid of." A small boy near the front studied Takeshi with intense curiosity. "Does he have kids too, like us?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Thompson looked toward Takeshi, then to her husband, unsure how to proceed. Frank Thompson cleared his throat. "Ask him yourself," he said to the boy. "Lieutenant, the one wants to know if you have children." Takeshi looked up, meeting the child's direct gaze. He nodded, then held up one finger. "A daughter," he said in his careful English. 5 years. The children absorbed this information with solemn expressions. Then the same red-haired girl who had first asked about him stepped forward, reaching into her coat pocket. She withdrew a small paper package and held it out toward Takeshi. "This is a cookie my mom made," she said clearly. "You can have it for your little girl." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward quickly. "Sarah, that's not appropriate." But Frank Thompson raised his hands, silencing his wife. His weathered face showed a complex emotion as he watched the interaction. Takeshi remained motionless, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected gesture. Sergeant Miller stood nearby, alert but making no move to intervene. The girl Sarah took another step forward, still holding out the cookie wrapped in wax paper. "It's chocolate chip. They're the best kind." Takeshi slowly set down his gardening tools and wiped his hands on a cloth. With careful movements, he accepted the small package, bowing slightly in the Japanese manner. "Thank you," he said. "Very kind." The simple exchange sent ripples through everyone present. The teacher looked concerned yet moved. Mrs. Thompson pressed her hand to her mouth. Frank Thompson stared at the floor, his expression hidden. Sarah smiled brightly, pleased with her gift being accepted, then rejoined her classmates. The teacher, recovering her composure, began guiding the children toward the exit, explaining that they needed to continue their tour. As they filed out, several children waved to Takeshi. After a moment's hesitation, he raised his hand in a small responsive gesture. When the greenhouse emptied of visitors, a profound silence descended. Frank Thompson turned to the seed trays, his back to Takeshi, but his voice carried clearly. "That girl's uncle died on the same ship as my Jimmy. Yet she gives you a cookie for your daughter, without a second thought." He shook his head slowly. "The little ones haven't learned proper hatred yet." The observation contained no anger, only a weary recognition of how hatred is cultivated rather than innate. Takeshi carefully placed the cookie in his pocket. He wouldn't eat it himself. It would be saved as a tangible reminder of this moment when a child's simple act of kindness had illuminated the artificial nature of enemy designations. That evening at Camp McCoy, news arrived that changed everything. The American guards seemed unusually solemn during dinner, and rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. Hiroshi approached Takeshi's table, his face pale. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "they're saying America has a new kind of bomb. They dropped it on Hiroshima yesterday. They say the entire city is gone." Takeshi stared at him, unable to process the information. An entire city? That's not possible. But the news was confirmed soon after by the camp commandant, who made a rare appearance in the mess hall to deliver an official statement. The Americans had indeed deployed an atomic weapon against Hiroshima with devastating effects. The Japanese government had been warned that unless they surrendered immediately, more cities would face the same fate. The prisoners received this news in stunned silence. Even Kenji, normally quick to dismiss American claims as propaganda, seemed shaken to his core. Back in the barracks, the men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. The concept of a single bomb destroying an entire city seemed beyond comprehension, yet the commandant's formal announcement left little room for denial. Takeshi found himself approached by men from both ideological camps within the prisoner community. Some sought reassurance that the news was exaggerated. Others asked what this might mean for Japan's capacity to continue fighting. All looked to him as one of the senior officers for some framework to understand this unprecedented development. He had no answers to offer, only the same confusion and concern they all shared. His thoughts turned immediately to Yuriko and Hanako. Were they safe in the countryside? How widespread was the destruction? Would other cities, including Osaka, where they had lived before the war, face similar annihilation? That night's sleep eluded most of the prisoners. Takeshi lay awake staring at the ceiling, the small cookie from Sarah still in his pocket, its presence now a surreal contrast to the apocalyptic news about Hiroshima. 3 days later, equally shocking news arrived. A second atomic bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. The impact was similarly devastating. Japan's situation had become untenable. On August 15, 1945, the prisoners of Camp McCoy were assembled in the main yard to hear an announcement that none had truly believed would come. In their lifetime, Emperor Hirohito had addressed the Japanese people directly via radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. The scene that followed defied simple description. Some men collapsed to their knees, overcome by shock and grief. Others stood rigidly at attention, as though maintaining military bearing could somehow deny the reality of defeat. A few openly wept. Kenji's reaction was perhaps the most extreme. The older man began shouting that the announcement must be American propaganda, that Japan would never surrender, that the emperor would never accept defeat. When guards approached to restrain him, he fought with such ferocity that it took 4 men to subdue him. As they led Kenji away, his eyes locked with Takeshi's. The accusation in them was unmistakable. You knew this would happen. You accepted it long before today. Perhaps there was some truth in that unspoken charge. Takeshi had indeed begun to recognize the inevitability of Japan's defeat, not through any special strategic insight, but through the accumulation of evidence that contradicted imperial propaganda. The abundance he witnessed at Camp McCoy, even under wartime rationing, spoke to American industrial capacity that Japan could not hope to match. The humane treatment of prisoners suggested a nation secure enough in its power to follow rules even with enemies. These were not the characteristics of a country on the verge of defeat, as Japanese military leaders had claimed. In the days following the surrender announcement, the atmosphere at Camp McCoy transformed. The rigid routine continued, but underneath it ran currents of uncertainty about what would happen next. The Americans announced that repatriation plans were being developed, but details remained scarce. Takeshi found himself appointed as one of the prisoner representatives working with camp authorities on preparation for eventual return to Japan. His relatively good English and measured temperament made him a natural choice for this role, though it further alienated him from Kenji and other hardliners. Frank Thompson requested Takeshi's presence at the farm one final time before repatriation began. When Takeshi arrived, escorted by Sergeant Miller, he found the farmer in his greenhouse, harvesting the first ripe tomatoes from the plants they had started together. "These grew from those seeds we planted," Thompson said, without preamble, holding out a perfectly ripe tomato. "Thought you should see what came of your work before you ship out." Takeshi accepted the tomato, feeling its warm weight in his palm. The simple fact of growth, of continuation despite war's disruption, seemed profoundly significant. "My wife wants you to have these," Thompson continued, indicating a small cloth bag on the workbench. "Seeds from these plants. Says maybe you can grow them when you get home. If you've got soil to plant in, that is." The implicit acknowledgement of Japan's devastated condition contained neither triumph nor mockery, only pragmatic recognition of reality. Takeshi accepted the seed bag with a formal bow. "Thank you, very generous." Thompson waved away the thanks awkwardly. "Martha's idea, not mine, but I don't object. Growing things makes more sense than killing them. Took me too long to remember that." They worked together for the last time, harvesting ripe tomatoes in comfortable silence. When it was time to leave, Thompson walked Takeshi to the truck where Miller waited. "Lieutenant," the farmer said formally, extending his hand in the American manner, "I won't say it's been a pleasure, but I will say you've changed how I think about certain things. Don't know if that matters to you." Takeshi accepted the handshake, recognizing the significance of the gesture from a man who had once spat at his feet in hatred. "It matters," he replied simply. Back at Camp McCoy, preparations for repatriation accelerated. The prisoners received final medical examinations, paperwork was processed, and personal effects were organized. Each man would be allowed to take a small bundle of possessions: letters from home, any handicrafts made during captivity, and a few practical items provided by the Red Cross. The night before their scheduled departure, Sergeant Miller sought out Takeshi in the recreation area where he sat with Hiroshi and several other prisoners. "Lieutenant," Miller said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper, "wanted to give you this before things get busy tomorrow." Takeshi unwrapped the package to find a notebook, its leather cover worn but sturdy, and a fountain pen. "Thought you might want to write things down," Miller explained. "Your English is getting pretty good. Maybe someday you'll want to tell this story." The thoughtfulness of the gift caught Takeshi off guard. He had never considered the possibility of recording his experiences, of treating them as something worth preserving rather than simply enduring. "Thank you," he said, extending his hand in the American style he had learned. "For this, for everything." Miller shook his hand firmly. "Strange world, isn't it? A year ago we were trying to kill each other. Now here we are." "Here we are," Takeshi agreed. The following morning, the prisoners of Camp McCoy boarded transport vehicles that would take them to the first stage of their long journey home. As Takeshi climbed into the truck, he glanced back at the camp that had been his world for nearly a year. The guard towers, the barbed wire, the wooden barracks, all had transformed in his perception from symbols of captivity to landmarks in his personal transformation. Sergeant Miller stood nearby overseeing the departure procedures. Their eyes met briefly, and Miller offered a small nod of recognition. No words were necessary for this final acknowledgement between men who had begun as enemies and ended as something not quite friends, but certainly no longer foes. The journey home was long and complicated. They traveled by train to the West Coast, then by ship across the Pacific. Throughout the voyage, uncertainty plagued the returning prisoners. What would they find in a defeated Japan? How would they be received by their countrymen? What place existed for imperial soldiers in a nation under American occupation? As their ship approached Yokohama Harbor, the first glimpses of Japan's devastation became visible. The once busy port showed extensive damage from bombing. Ships lay partially submerged near the docks. Cranes stood twisted and broken against the skyline. When they disembarked, the full impact of defeat confronted them unavoidably. Japanese civilians moved through the ruined streets with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Children with hollow cheeks watched the returning prisoners with solemn eyes that had witnessed too much. American occupation forces were visible throughout the city, their well-fed frames and crisp uniforms in stark contrast to the local population. Some Japanese citizens lowered their eyes when Americans passed. Others stared with carefully blank expressions that concealed whatever emotions churned beneath. The returning prisoners received brief processing by both American authorities and representatives of the new Japanese civilian government. They were issued small stipends for immediate needs and basic information about transportation to their home regions, then released. No bands played for their return. No crowds cheered. Japan had no capacity for ceremonial welcomes, nor any inclination to celebrate the return of men who represented a military that had led the nation to unprecedented defeat. Takeshi stood at the processing center exit, his small bundle of possessions clutched under one arm. The Thompson seeds Sarah's cookie wrapped carefully in cloth, Miller's notebook, and letters from Yuriko. These formed the physical archive of his war experience. Hiroshi approached to say goodbye before heading to his family home in northern Japan. "Lieutenant," he said formally, bowing, "it has been an honor serving with you." Takeshi returned the bow. "The honor was mine, Tanaka-san. I wish you well in whatever comes next." "And you, perhaps when things settle?" Hiroshi hesitated. "Perhaps we might correspond someday. I would be interested to know how your tomatoes grow from the American seeds." The simple request for continued connection moved Takeshi deeply. "I would welcome your letters," he replied sincerely. They parted ways, then two men among thousands returning to a nation fundamentally changed, carrying experiences that most of their countrymen could never fully comprehend. Takeshi began the final leg of his journey to the rural village, where Yuriko and Hanako had taken refuge with their parents. The train system operated sporadically with damage evident along every route. When no trains were available, he walked, joining the streams of displaced Japanese moving across the countryside. 3 days after leaving Yokohama, he arrived at the small farming village. Unlike urban centers, it showed little direct damage from bombing, but the impact of war remained visible in the thin frames of its inhabitants and the absence of young men. He approached his in-laws' modest home with unexpected trepidation. What would Yuriko think of him now? Would Hanako remember him at all? How could he explain what he had experienced, how he had changed? Before he could reach the door, it slid open. Yuriko stood framed in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth as she recognized him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she ran toward him, propriety forgotten in the shock of reunion. As they embraced for the first time in nearly 4 years, Takeshi felt the difference in her body, the new thinness, the prominent bones beneath her simple clothes. Yet she was alive, whole here in his arms. "Takeshi," she whispered his name, a prayer on her lips. "You came back to us." A small figure appeared in the doorway, watching uncertainly. Hanako had grown so much, transforming from the toddler in his memory to a solemn-eyed child of nearly 7. Takeshi knelt, opening his arms to her. "Hanako-chan," he said gently, "do you remember your father?" The child studied him carefully, looking from his face to her mother for confirmation. Yuriko nodded encouragingly. Slowly, hesitantly, Hanako approached. When she was close enough, Takeshi reached into his pocket and withdrew the carefully preserved cookie, now somewhat crushed from the long journey. "An American girl named Sarah sent this for you," he said, holding it out. "She is about your age." Hanako accepted the unexpected gift with wide eyes. An American girl, but Americans are enemies. The simple statement reflecting what the child had absorbed from the world around her crystallized everything Takeshi had come to understand. "No, little one," he said quietly. "There are no true enemies, only people on different sides." As Hanako cautiously unwrapped the precious cookie, Takeshi met Yuriko's questioning gaze over their daughter's head. There would be time later to explain everything. The camp, the hamburgers and Coca-Cola, Frank Thompson and his tomato seeds, Sergeant Miller and his notebook, the little girl Sarah and her simple act of kindness. Time to share how these experiences had transformed him, how they might help chart a course through the uncertain future facing Japan. For now, it was enough to be home to hold his family close to begin the process of rebuilding not just their lives, but their understanding of a world more complex and ultimately more hopeful than war had led them to believe. That evening, as Hanako slept and the adults spoke quietly around a modest meal, Takeshi's father-in-law asked the question that many Japanese would pose to returning soldiers. Was it as bad as they say the American captivity? Takeshi considered how to answer, how to convey the profound contradiction of his experience. "They fed us hamburgers," he said finally, "and gave us Coca-Cola to drink. And in that simple meal, I learned more about America than all our military training ever taught us." His father-in-law looked confused, expecting stories of hardship rather than food. Takeshi opened Miller's notebook and began to write, forming English words that captured what he could not yet fully express in Japanese. "I thought my enemy would break me with cruelty. Instead, they broke me with kindness. And in that breaking, I found a greater strength than hatred could ever provide." 30 years later, Takeshi Nakamura sat in his garden in Osaka surrounded by descendants of Frank Thompson's tomato plants. Beside him, his granddaughter listened attentively as he shared the story he had told countless times over the decades. "So you see," he concluded, "sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't bombs or bullets. Sometimes they're hamburgers and Coca-Cola seeds and cookies, small acts of kindness when hatred would be easier." He removed from his pocket an old worn leather notebook filled with decades of reflections. "Sergeant Miller was right when he gave me this. Some stories need to be told, especially when they remind us that humanity can survive even the darkest times." His granddaughter considered this with the seriousness of youth. "But grandfather, if the Americans were so kind, why did they drop the atomic bombs?" "Because war makes all of us less than we should be," Takeshi replied. "Even the most decent people can make terrible choices when caught in war's machinery. That's why the small moments of humanity matter so much. They show us who we can be when the fighting ends." He handed her a small cloth bag containing seeds from that season's tomatoes. "Plant these," he said, "and remember that even enemies can share the same soil, the same sun, the same capacity for growth." I learned that lesson over a hamburger in 1944, and it has nourished me ever since.